Web Planet, the fifth serial of Doctor Who's second season, first broadcast in 6 parts from the 13th of February to the 20th of March 1965, and written by Bill Strusson. Now, carrying on from the previous Doctor Who story, The Romans, the TARDIS crew, aka the Doctor, played at this point in time by William Hartnell, and his companions Ian Chesterton, played by William Russell, Barbara Wright, played by Jacqueline Hill, and Vicky Pallister, played by Maureen O'Brien, find themselves being drawn into a particular planet. A planet with several moons around it. And the Doctor and Ian end up going out to investigate, leaving Barbara and Vicky aboard the TARDIS, while Barbara ends up having a bit of a chat with Vicky, and there is some pretty humorous parts, like I think she tries to give her some aspirin to help Vicky to sleep, whereas Vicky considers this to be kind of old person medicine, and Barbara's like, well, just humour me, okay? I don't know, I find it funny. Anyway, the Doctor and Ian go out to explore the landscape and end up having to wear certain clothes that made them look a little bit like milkmen. I'm sorry to say, no offence to milkmen out there, but it just makes them look a little bit kind of silly with the long white coats. Thankfully they abandoned that early on. The Doctor eventually realises that they have landed on the planet of Vortis, which he finds is strange because Vortis he thought previously had no moons. But Barbara ends up being called across the landscape by a gold bracelet that she got during the Roman era. And eventually the TARDIS group find there are 2 warring species on the planet of Vortis. There's the butterfly-like Menoptera, played by a range of actors and actresses, including Rosalind de Winter, Arne Gordon, Arthur Blake, Jolyon Booth, Jocelyn Birdsall, Martin Jarvis, Ian Thompson, and Barbara Joss. As I said, they kind of resemble either giant moths, giant bees, or like butterfly-like creatures. Meanwhile, they're seemingly at war with an ant-like species known as the Zarbi, which is basically like giant ants kind of crawling across the surface. They've got several actors. While the Zarbi don't really have lines, they're played by actors such as Robert Jewell, Jack Pitt, Gerald Taylor, Hugh Lund, Kevin Manser, and John Scott Martin. And as well as the Zarbi and the Menoptera, they also end up encountering descendants of the Menoptera called the Optera, who have seemingly spent a long time underground. And basically what has happened is that Vortis has seemingly become barren, like acid now rains out instead of water. So the TARDIS team have to find a way to kind of satisfy both sides and figure out a way to stop whatever's happening. Because it turns out that the Zarbi are mainly being controlled by a spider-like intelligence beneath the surface called the Animus, voiced by Catherine Fleming. So they have to figure out a way to stop the Animus, turn the Zarbi back to normal, and ultimately gain peace between the 2 races. Ultimately, this was a story that I do admit had its ups and downs. Like when I first saw the Zarbi, to which is very clearly just the kind of the shell of a giant ant that they've pieced together, and then you can very clearly tell the human legs underneath. At first I was like, ooh, that's a rather cheap effect. I felt rather like Ncuti Gatwa in The Legend of Ruby Sunday when they show him the time window. He's like, this is rough. This is thrown together. But apparently this story mainly came about because when they got into the second season of Doctor Who and they began to hit their stride, the Daleks had been an unexpected hit for the show, and the Daleks were already coming back with the Dalek invasion of Earth earlier this season. But they wanted to try and come up with another alien species that might capture the public's imagination, whether it was the Zarbi or the Menoptera. And this one, people are divided on it. Like, I'm sure you're going to have people who like it. I personally thought the Zarbi looked a little bit cheap in places, but I don't know, I grew to kind of like them throughout the story, and ultimately, Doctor Who's never been one for the huge monster effects. I mean, yes, they did get them more and more as the show went on, especially in the New Who era, but sometimes the appeal of Doctor Who is just how cheap it is, particularly with the butterfly-like costumes for the Menoptera. I'll admit, there are some points where I looked at it as like, yeah, okay, this is a little bit cheap, but at the same time it's charming. that's not to say it always works, though. I mean, there were a couple of moments throughout this particular story where I did wonder whether I had to clean my glasses, because they used a few smear effects when the Doctor and Co are out kind of on the planet looking around. They used kind of smear effects to kind of make it seem a little bit more alien, and just there were points when I did wonder if my glasses were dirty or whether it was just part of the effect, and most of the time it was just part of the effect. But ultimately, I think it's an enjoyable story. It shows how cheap Doctor Who can be, but at the same time shows how well they can work with cheap effects. Ultimately, the characters, I think, are all likeable enough, and the one thing that I will say again that did kind of stand against it was, when it came to the kind of big defeat of the Animus, I wasn't entirely sure what exactly happened, because at first it seems like the Doctor and Vicky are in there, and the Doctor's seemingly passed out, and Vicky is trying to stay awake, but then she ultimately comes down to it, and then Barbara and some of the Monotra burst in. They try to defeat the Animus with the technology, the weapon that they brought, and that seemingly fails. And then Ian bursts in, and just like when it's eventually defeated, I'm left wondering, I'm not entirely sure what happened. Like, how exactly did they beat it? To me, the ending got a little bit confusing. But at the same time, this was a story where they were trying to capture the public's imagination with more kind of alien creatures like Doctor Who would go on to do. Whether it worked or not, that's up to you. Personally, I thought it was charming enough. It showed that what Doctor Who could do with a small budget, and they really tried, and they managed a pretty enjoyable tale. Well, that for me is actually it for my classic Doctor Who review, because at the moment in time that I'm recording this, this was the last Doctor Who, classic Doctor Who story I needed to get. And until they actually release more animated recreations of classic stories, or find those classic stories, there are 11 classic stories out there at this point in time that are still yet to be animated. But until I find those, I've watched all the classic Doctor Who I can. Like, the Web Planet was the last piece I needed of the first Doctor's era. In terms of what remains, if I can remember these correctly in the correct order, there's Marco Polo from the first season. After that, there's The Crusade, which I think directly followed this story. Marco Polo, The Crusade. There's the Daleks. No, hang on, no, not the Daleks Master Plan. Hold on a second, I'll work this out. There's the Myth. Yeah, no, there's Mission to the Unknown, The Myth Makers, the Daleks Master Plan, the Crusade. No, not the Crusade. Sorry. The Massacre, or as you prefer to call it, the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve, the Savages, the Smugglers, and then from the second Doctor's era, there's also the Highlanders, the Wheel of Space, and the Space Pirates. So until they end up either finding those stories or releasing animated recreations of them, that's it for my classic Doctor Who playlist. Feel free to check out any of my other reviews I've done. I'm not sure which side it is, but check out any of the other stories I've done, and you know what? I'm glad I've seen this. I now have as complete as can be for now, classic Doctor Who collection. Anyway, will it end up being my next review? Don't know at this point, I'll have to wait and see. Till next time, see ya.